The history of cast iron dates back to 800 BC, when metallurgists in China began manufacturing the material by melting iron ore and mixing it with carbon, silicon, manganese, sulfur, and phosphorus. The process of making cast iron involves melting iron ore in a blast furnace and then pouring the liquid iron into ingots called pigs. The pig iron is then melted down and mixed with scrap and alloying elements in cupola furnaces. This newly mixed liquid metal is then poured into molds to produce the desired product. We will learn more about cast iron and maybe one of the most popular scouting cooking implements, the Dutch oven, in this edition of Artifact of the Week. Cast iron is generally categorized as either gray iron or white iron. Gray iron contains a higher concentration of silicon in its composition and is less hard and more machinable than white iron. The earliest cast iron artifacts date to the 5th century BC and were discovered by archaeologists in China. The ancient Chinese used cast iron to mold weapons, manufacture plows, and build pagodas. More than 1,000 years ago, Central African blacksmiths developed sophisticated methods of welding, soldering, and casting that they used to create weapons and tools such as hoes. During the 14th and 15th centuries, cast iron made its way to Europe and England. Henry VIII initiated the casting of cannons in England to replace the more prevalent and much more expensive bronze cannons. While the cast iron cannons were much heavier, this conversion allowed the English to better arm their navy. Cast iron made its way to America with the first ironworks being established in Virginia in 1619. By the 1700s, cast iron became cheaper to manufacture and easier to work with than wrought iron, and its load-bearing strength made it an important structural metal. So now that we know a little about the history of cast iron, let's take a closer look at the development of the Dutch oven. The first Dutch ovens were nothing like what we refer to as a Dutch oven today. The Dutch called these early cooking pots a braadpan or souterpan, and they were heat-sealed earthenware pots. Some of the earliest examples of these pots show up in the paintings of Dutch masters such as Vermeer's The Milkmaid. Later, the Dutch began to cast brass into cooking vessels, creating a wide range of pots, pans, and casserole dishes. Their process used sand to make the molds and that produced a very high-quality pot with smooth surfaces. In the early 1700s, an Englishman, Abraham Darby, co-owner of the Brassworks Company of Bristol, traveled to the Netherlands to learn how the Dutch were able to create these brass pots so much cheaper and of higher quality than anywhere else in Europe. Upon returning to England, Darby realized the high cost of materials and labor were much too high for him to make a decent profit on these brass pots, so he started to look for a way to create kitchenware affordable and bring the poor into the market for home goods. Darby began experimenting with using the Dutch sand casting method with iron instead of brass. Over the next couple of years, he experimented with casting iron into cookware, and in 1707 he was granted a patent for the process of casting iron in sand molds. While Darby's process was based on the Dutch process for casting brass, it wasn't until 1710 that the term Dutch oven was used to describe Darby's new cast iron cookware. Of course, the story of the Dutch oven doesn't end there. Because of their versatility and durability, American colonists brought these pots to the colonies and used them to boil, bake, stew, fry, and roast their food. These cast iron cookware were considered so valuable that wills in the 18th and 19th centuries frequently spelled out who would inherit these pots and pans. It is reported that Mary Ball Washington, mother of President George Washington, specified in her will that one half of her iron cooking furniture should go to her grandson and the other half to her granddaughter. And like most things that came to the colonies, the Americans set about to change and improve on the design of the Dutch oven, with Paul Revere being credited with adding the 3 legs to the bottom of the Dutch oven so it could be used without having to hang it above the heat source, and the flat lid with a raised lip to allow coals to be placed on top, making the cooking method more efficient and effective. As Americans began to expand westward, the Dutch oven became a part of nearly every traveling party. Lewis and Clark carried Dutch ovens with them as they explored the American Northwest between 1804 and 1806. With the Dutch ovens, they were one of the few items that they kept from their explorations and reportedly took home with them. Mormon pioneers also took along their Dutch ovens as they settled the Great Salt Lake Valley in the 1850s. This was recognized in the handcart pioneer statue on Temple Square in Salt Lake City, where a Dutch oven hangs from the front of the cart. Mountain men used Dutch ovens to cook as they explored the American frontier into the late 19th century, and Dutch ovens were a part of every Western cattle drive as a staple in the chuck wagons that kept cowboys fed. In 1896, Joseph Lodge built a cast iron foundry in Tennessee, where the Lodge Company still produces their famous cast iron Dutch ovens. Of course, the role of the Dutch oven in scouting goes back to the earliest days of the BSA. As early as May of 1915, you could buy an official BSA Dutch oven as advertised in Scouting magazine. And Boys Life magazine talks about using Dutch ovens in the Real Scout Craft in the Woods column written by F.A. Crosby in the June 1912 issue of the magazine. Stories in 1913 and 1914 issues also mention the use of Dutch ovens, including a reference to cooking a Christmas turkey in a Dutch oven, as Kit Carson would have done. On display here at the National Scouting Museum, we have a Dutch oven that was used by R.C. Doc Loomis during his time here at Philmont. Doc also wrote a small 4-page booklet called On the Trail with Your Knife, Axe, and Dutch Oven. The booklet ends with a description of how to make biscuits, including a basic recipe that can be adjusted to make pancakes, coffee cake, and cornbread. Loomis talks about the versatility of the Dutch oven and its lid, which can serve as a griddle for making those pancakes or broiling a steak. He closes out the writing with instructions on how to clean your Dutch oven. You should never scour your Dutch oven or scrape it with a knife. Use a scrub brush or a cloth, then after it's wiped dry, put it on the heat again and grease it so it won't rust. After bread has been removed, it only needs wiping out with a cloth to remove the crumbs and smear grease evenly all over. Then it will be ready for tomorrow or a year from tomorrow. Another item we have here at the museum is Nancy Wells' 1972 Ranger Notebook, which includes the recipe for Ranger Cobbler, which Nancy tells me was prepared for the crew on the second night of their trek before the Ranger left them on the morning of day 3. While the Dutch oven remains a staple of many kitchens, the classic cast iron Dutch oven can be found being used at scout camps all over the country, including here at Philmont, where every week the staff of the Philmont Training Center prep as many as 30 cobblers for participants and staff to enjoy. By the way, the Dutch oven is the official state cooking pot of Texas, Utah, and Arkansas. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Join us next time as we continue to learn more about the history of the BSA through the collection of the National Scouting Museum and Artifact of the Week.